The first confession came quickly, but it belonged to the wrong person. Welcome to Echoes of Clues. I am your host, Shadow Teller. Share your location in the comments. I read them all. Let's begin. The village of Hartswell liked to think of itself as the sort of place where unpleasant things did not properly happen. Rain happened, certainly. So did gossip, cracked church windows, unsuitable engagements, and on one memorable occasion, a swan in the haberdasher's doorway. But those were inconveniences, not tragedies. Hartswell was a village of clipped hedges, polished brass, and women who knew exactly how much jam ought to go into a Victoria sponge. Even its scandals had always possessed a certain tidiness. That was why the summer fete began so well. By 2:30, the green behind sang. A Jude's church was crowded with striped stalls and cheerful bunting that fluttered in the warm July breeze. Children streaked past with paper windmills. A retired colonel argued with the vicar over the proper rules of coconut shy. Someone had brought a gramophone, and a jaunty tune kept drifting in and out between the rose tent and the white elephant stall. At the edge of the green, under the careful shade of an old chestnut tree, sat Mrs. Lavinia Vale in a folding cane chair, observing everything with the placid attention of a woman who seemed to be resting, and never truly was. Mrs. Vale was 74, slight, silver-haired, and fond of soft grey cardigans even in weather that others considered too warm for wool. She had the kind of face people trusted instantly and underestimated soon after. In Hartswell, she was known chiefly for her courtesy, her excellent seed cake, and an apparently innocent habit of remembering things that other people would have preferred forgotten. She was not alone. Beside her sat her friend Mrs. Edith Pritchard, who had a formidable hat pinned to her head and the expression of someone prepared to find fault with an entire afternoon. "I said from the first," Mrs. Pritchard remarked, watching two boys trample the church daisy border, "that putting the tombola next to the cakes was foolish. Excitement and buttercream never mix." Mrs. Vale smiled faintly. "No, though in fairness, excitement seems to mix very well with everything else." Mrs. Pritchard sniffed. "There is far too much excitement. It attracts the wrong sort of feeling." By the tea-urn, Miss Celia Dorrance turned at that moment and laughed at something said by Mr. Hugo Fenwick, who stood close beside her with a tray of cups. Celia was pretty in the fresh, polished manner of women who had once been girls, everyone called sweet, and now found themselves called charming. She wore a pale blue dress, a string of pearls too formal for a village fete, and a smile that had lately become somewhat careful. Hugo Fenwick, dark and elegant in a cream summer suit, was not from Hartswell originally, though he had done his best over the past year to establish himself in it. He had leased Rosebank House after the death of old Mrs. Alton and had already joined the parish council, the cricket committee, and, rather more quickly than people thought prudent, the social life of every eligible household within 4 miles. "He is too smooth," said Mrs. Pritchard. Mrs. Vale said mildly, "Yes. I never trust smooth men, or smooth women, come to that." "No," Mrs. Vale agreed. "Rough edges are often much safer. One sees where one is with them." At the bottle stall, a broad-shouldered man with sun-reddened skin and a stubborn mouth was stacking prizes with more force than delicacy. This was Daniel Mercer, whose family had kept the ironmongery in Hartswell High Street for nearly 80 years. He had the air of a man who had once expected life to move in a particular direction and had not forgiven it for wandering off elsewhere. When Celia laughed again at something Hugo said, Daniel's hand tightened visibly on the neck of a ginger beer bottle. Mrs. Vale watched that too. Near the church gate, Mrs. Beatrice Lark was selling raffle tickets with the bright determination of a woman whose finances depended on being thought cheerful. Her husband had died years before, leaving debts and a well-upholstered reputation for generosity that had been rather easier to admire than to settle. Mrs. Lark had since acquired 2 boarders, 3 migraine conditions, and a smile that wavered only when she believed no one was looking. Behind the plant stall, Dr. Julian Kershaw stood with his hands in his pockets and looked as though he regretted having come at all. He was a handsome man, though in a tired way, and his hair had the untidy disorder of someone who began his days early and ended them late. He had been Hartswell's doctor for 12 years and knew the insides of most households almost as well as he knew their patients. Beside him, his sister Florence, precise as a pin and twice as sharp, rearranged potted geraniums into rows of military discipline. "Too many people," Florence said under her breath. "That is the usual feature of a fete," said the doctor. "Yes, but today there is a mood." Julian glanced at her. "What sort of mood?" "The sort that comes before a storm, only not weather." Mrs. Vale, seated some distance away, could not hear the remark, yet she might have agreed with it, for there was a strain beneath the afternoon's brightness, not visible to everyone but present all the same. It moved under conversation like a current under still water. One noticed it in pauses, in altered expressions, in the way certain people did not quite look at one another. Miss Agnes Trewin, who ran the lending library and possessed the sharpest airs in the county, was saying to anyone who came within reach that Mr. Fenwick had no business being so familiar with Celia Dorrance when Daniel Mercer had clearly been attached to her since Easter. Miss Trewin offered this as social concern, though no one doubted she enjoyed the carrying of it. At the same time, Mrs. Fenlow, from the post office, was informing the Jam Judging Committee that she had seen Celia receive a letter that morning and go quite white upon reading it. "It was not from Daniel," Mrs. Fenlow said darkly, with the authority of someone who handled envelopes daily and considered herself an expert in the emotional significance of handwriting. On the platform by the bandstand, Sir Basil Wren, local magistrate and owner of Wren Hall, prepared to open the fete officially. And he was a florid man with a commanding voice and a conviction that every village occasion improved if he announced it. His daughter Lydia stood nearby, holding a bouquet and looking bored in an expensive, city-made sort of way. Lydia had returned to Hartswell for the summer after some unexplained difficulty in London and found village life beneath her except when it offered useful drama. "It will all end badly," murmured Mrs. Pritchard. Mrs. Vale turned her head. "The speech?" No, everything else." Sir Basil rapped the microphone twice, producing a whine that made the children squeal and several adults wince. "My dear friends," he boomed, "what a splendid turnout! A true testament to Hartswell's spirit." The rest of the speech washed over the green in waves of self-congratulation. People smiled, clapped in the right places, nodded and shifted their weight patiently. Behind the bandstand, beyond the hedge that bordered the churchyard path, a rook gave a harsh cry. Mrs. Vale's attention had drifted elsewhere. Hugo Fenwick had moved away from Celia and was speaking now to Beatrice Lark. The exchange lasted only a moment, but Beatrice's hand jerked so abruptly that a strip of raffle tickets tore unevenly. Hugo said something low and smiling. Beatrice's face lost all color. Then he touched the brim of his hat and strolled away, looking perfectly at ease. A little later, Daniel Mercer crossed the grass toward Celia. He did not reach her. Dr. Kershaw intercepted him with some comment or request, and though Daniel stopped, the set of his shoulders did not soften. He answered briefly, then looked past the doctor at Celia and Hugo with such naked resentment that even Mrs. Pritchard noticed it. "There now," she said. "Jealousy, always vulgar and always dangerous." Mrs. Vale folded her hands in her lap. "Not always. Sometimes it is merely sad." At 3 o'clock the competitions began. Children shrieked at the hoopla. Tea was poured. The cake table did a violent trade in sponge and currant buns. The vicar's wife lost a shilling and found 6 opinions about where she ought to have kept it. Hartswell, for half an hour, became exactly what it believed itself to be: harmless, bustling, pleasantly foolish. And then Mrs. Vale saw Celia Dorrance go behind the bandstand. It was not in itself remarkable. Young women often disappeared briefly at fête, either to avoid unsuitable conversation or to repair powder and composure. What drew Mrs. Vale's attention was not the movement, but the expression. Miss Celia was not merely flustered. She was frightened. A minute later, Hugo Fenwick followed. He did not seem hurried. That, oddly enough, was what made it noticeable. He went with deliberate leisure, glancing once over his shoulder before disappearing behind the striped canvas screen at the rear of the platform. Mrs. Vale's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Pritchard was saying something about gooseberry preserves, but had the good fortune not to require an answer. Mrs. Vale continued to look toward the back of the bandstand. The hedge and stacked crates obscured the space there. One could not see the narrow passage leading toward the churchyard gate, only the occasional flutter of bunting in the wind. Then Daniel Mercer, who had been at the bottle stall, set down a crate and went after them. This time even Mrs. Pritchard followed the direction of her friend's gaze. "Well," she said, "that looks promising in the worst way." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Vale, "for observation in the best way. Are you going to sit here?" "For the moment." Mrs. Pritchard gave a small, exasperated sound. "Lavinia, 3 people have just gone behind the bandstand with expressions out of a melodrama." "Yes," said Mrs. Vale, "which is exactly why a 4th person appearing there too soon would be a pity. People are much more informative when they imagine themselves unwatched." Mrs. Pritchard knew from experience that this meant Mrs. Vale would remain where she was until she had some inward reason for moving. She opened her mouth, perhaps to argue, but was interrupted by applause as Sir Basil concluded his remarks. The band struck up. A dog barked. Somewhere, a child began to cry because he had dropped a toffee apple in the dust. The ordinary noises of the fete continued for perhaps 2 more minutes. Then a woman screamed. Not the playful shriek of surprise that village occasions often produced, nor the theatrical squeal of girls pretending alarm. This was a full, involuntary sound, torn straight from the body. It cut through music, conversation, and summer air with such force that every head on the green turned at once toward the back of the bandstand. The gramophone needle scratched and stopped. For 1 fractional second, no one moved. Then movement broke everywhere. People surged toward the hedge. Someone shouted, "What is it?" A child was pulled back sharply by the arm. Sir Basil descended from the platform in pompous confusion. Dr. Kershaw was already running. "Mrs." Pritchard half rose, then sat down again because her knees objected, and said in a shocked whisper, "Good heavens." Mrs. Vale stood. She did not hurry. That was one of her peculiarities. While other people rushed forward in noise and disorder, she crossed the grass at a measured pace, her eyes taking in details the crowd immediately obscured from itself. The scream had come from Beatrice Lark. She stood at the corner of the hedge with both hands pressed to her mouth, raffle tickets scattered around her shoes like pale leaves. Her eyes were fixed on the ground beyond the crates. Dr. Kershaw had dropped to one knee beside a fallen figure. At first, from where she stood, Mrs. Vale saw only the cream of a summer suit against the dusty grass. Then the crowd shifted. Hugo Fenwick lay on his back beside the churchyard path. The one arm bent under him, the other flung wide as though in surprise. His straw hat had rolled into the nettles. There was a dark stain spreading at the front of his jacket, small but unmistakable. His face, still handsome a quarter of an hour earlier, had already acquired the dreadful blankness of something interrupted beyond recall. Celia Dorrance stood 3 paces away, white as paper. Daniel Mercer stood beside her. And before Dr. Kershaw could even rise, before Sir Basil could demand order, before anyone present had properly understood what they were looking at, Daniel said in a hard, level voice that seemed to strike the whole green into silence, "I did it." The words landed among them like a second blow. Celia made a strangled sound. Beatrice Lark began to cry in short, frightened gasps. Sir Basil stared as if the village ironmonger had suddenly begun speaking Norwegian. Daniel did not alter his expression. "I killed him," he said. There was no tremor in it, no confusion, only a bleak certainty. At the edge of the crowd, scarcely noticed by anyone, Mrs. Lavinia Vale looked from the dead man to the living one who had confessed, and a very slight line appeared between her brows. Because Daniel Mercer, though angry enough to quarrel and proud enough to make himself miserable, did not look like a man who had just told the truth. He looked like a man who had chosen it, and those, Mrs. Vale knew, were two very different things. For a moment, no one seemed able to move at all. The confession hung in the warm air, while the fate, so carefully arranged and so smugly peaceful only minutes before, collapsed into murmurs, to startled breaths and the first thin cries of frightened children being gathered away by their mothers. Then Dr. Kershaw rose from his knee beside the body, his face set into a professional calm that did not conceal his alarm. "No one is to touch anything," he said sharply. "Sir Basil, please send someone for the police at once." Sir Basil, who had gone an unattractive shade of pink, drew himself up. Yes, naturally. Mercer, do you understand what you've just said?" Daniel Mercer did not look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Hugo Fenwick's body with a terrible stillness. "I said I killed him." Celia Dorrance swayed where she stood. Florence Kershaw, appearing from nowhere with the uncanny speed of capable women in emergencies, caught her by the elbow before she could fall. Celia gave Florence one blind and grateful glance, but said nothing. Her lips trembled. Her hands were clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white. Mrs. Vale, arriving at the outer edge of the cluster, let her gaze move quietly from one face to another. Beatrice Lark was in genuine distress. That much was plain, though whether from shock, fear, or some deeper cause remained to be seen. Sir Basil was outraged in the abstract, as if the crime had been committed chiefly against village order. Dr. Kershaw was thinking medically. Florence was thinking practically. Daniel Mercer looked like a man who had braced himself under a weight and would not now shift it. Only Celia looked as though the world had altered shape beneath her feet. "Take Miss Dorrance to the vicarage," Florence said crisply to Mrs. Fenlow, who had drifted forward in fascinated horror. "As and for once in your life, do not chatter." Mrs. Fenlow, affronted into obedience, took Celia's arm. Celia resisted for one moment and looked toward Daniel. "Don't," she said, and though the word was very soft, Mrs. Vale heard it. Daniel gave no sign he had heard. 2 village constables arrived first, breathless and self-important, having bicycled from the station at Little Parham, and with them came Sergeant Tibbet, a square, cautious man with the expression of one perpetually bracing for incompetence in others. He listened to Sir Basil, to Dr. Kershaw, and finally to Daniel Mercer himself. "You admit to killing Mr. Fenwick?" Tibbet asked. "Yes." "With what?" There was the smallest pause. "A knife." "Where is it?" Daniel looked at the ground, then toward the hedge, as if the question had only just occurred to him. "I dropped it." The sergeant's eyes sharpened. "Where?" "I don't know." That, Mrs. Vale thought, was interesting. The constables began searching the grass and nettles, while Tibbet took down names and positions in a notebook already damp at the edges from his hand. He asked who had found the body. Beatrice Lark, after much trembling and 2 starts, explained that she had gone behind the bandstand looking for a missing book of raffle tickets and had seen Mr. Fenwick on the ground. No, she had not seen the blow struck. No, she had not seen Daniel arrive. Yes, Miss Dorrance had been there already. So had Daniel, or almost at once after. It was all confusion. She could not be expected, surely, to remember clearly after such a shock. "Quite," said Sergeant Tibbet, writing steadily. "And Miss Dorrance?" he asked. Mrs. Fenlow, as who had returned from escorting Celia only as far as the vicarage gate and no farther than propriety allowed, answered eagerly that Miss Dorrance was in no fit state to speak. Florence Kershaw cut across her to say that Celia had had a severe shock and ought not to be pressed immediately. Tibbet grunted. She'll have to be spoken to soon enough. Mrs. Vale let the exchange pass without comment. She had no authority here, and authority, she had long ago observed, was often easiest to manage when it imagined itself unobserved. The knife was not found. That fact altered the mood perceptibly. A straightforward confession with a weapon ready to hand might have satisfied the village for an hour or two. But an invisible knife introduced discomfort, and discomfort gave rise to thought. People began whispering more carefully. Their eyes moved from Daniel to the ground, from the ground to Celia's empty place, and back again. Sergeant Tibbet closed his notebook. "Mr. Mercer, I'll have to ask you to come with us." Daniel nodded as if he had expected nothing else. At last, he lifted his head, and his eyes met Mrs. Vale's across the thinning crowd. It lasted only a second, but in it she saw not fury, nor even despair, but a grim, almost deliberate resignation. It was the expression of a man stepping into cold water because he has decided it must be done. As the constables moved to either side of him, a voice broke from the path. "It isn't true." Everyone turned. Celia Dorrance had come back, pale and unsteady, one hand gripping the vicarage gatepost as though it alone kept her upright. Mrs. Fenlow, scandalized and thrilled, hovered uselessly behind her. Daniel's face changed at last. Not much, but enough. Celia took 2 steps forward. "He didn't do it," she said, and now the tremor in her voice was matched by something stronger. "He's saying it for my sake." A ripple passed through the villagers like wind through dry leaves. Sergeant Tibbet stared. Sir Basil made a sound of outraged disbelief. Mrs. Pritchard, from a strategic distance, shut her eyes briefly as if to say that matters were becoming exactly as dreadful as she had anticipated. Mrs. Vale did not move. She only folded her hands together and looked with renewed attention at the 3 people standing in the wreckage of the fate: the dead man on the grass, the man who had confessed too quickly, and the young woman who had now told the village that the confession was false. And because one lie was always company for another, and she knew the real beginning of the case had only just arrived. Sergeant Tibbet did not immediately speak. For a moment, he simply looked from Celia Dorrance to Daniel Mercer, and then down at the body, as though hoping the dead man might offer clarification. When none was forthcoming, he drew a slow breath and restored his authority with visible effort. "Miss Dorrance," he said, "you'd best be very sure of what you're saying." "I am sure," Celia replied. Her voice trembled still, but the words came with a steadiness that had not been there before. "Daniel didn't kill him." Daniel made a sharp movement. "Celia." "No." She turned on him with surprising force. "You mustn't." That, Mrs. Vale thought, was not the reaction of a woman inventing a story on the spot. It had the feel of something long feared and suddenly unavoidable. Sergeant Tibbet's gaze narrowed. "Then perhaps you can tell me who did." Celia hesitated. For a fraction of a second, her composure faltered. Her eyes moved, not to the body, not to Daniel, but across the gathered faces. It was a searching glance, quick and uncertain, and it stopped, just for an instant, on Beatrice Lark. Beatrice let out a small, strangled sound and shook her head violently. No, I saw nothing. I told you, I saw nothing." "I didn't say you had," Celia said, almost sharply, and then seemed to realize the effect of it. Her hands trembled again. I only mean Daniel is not the sort." "Sorts have very little to do with it," said Tibbet dryly. "Facts do, and at present the only fact I have is a dead man and a confession." "A wrong confession," Celia insisted. Daniel laughed once, shortly. That's a convenient idea." She looked at him again, and this time the fear in her face was unmistakable. Not fear of him, but for him. Mrs. Vale, standing slightly apart, observed the exchange with quiet absorption. The interplay between the two young people had shifted. Daniel's stubborn certainty had developed a strain of urgency, while Celia's distress was threaded now with resolve. It suggested not merely disagreement, but knowledge unequally shared. "Enough," said Sergeant Tibbet. "Mr. Mercer, you're still coming with us. Miss Dorrance, you'll remain available for questioning, and until I say otherwise, no one is to leave Hartswell without informing the police." This produced a fresh murmur, though a subdued one. The boundaries of the village, so comfortable and unquestioned before, now felt suddenly like the edges of a net. "Doctor," Kershaw straightened from his examination of the body. "He's been dead only a few minutes," he said. "No more than 10, I should say. The wound is small but precise. Straight to the heart." "A steady hand, then," Tibbet muttered. Mrs. Vale noted that as well. A steady hand, and perhaps a certain familiarity. The constables, still fruitlessly searching the hedge and grass, reported no sign of the knife. Tibbet swore under his breath. It didn't vanish into thin air. "No," said Mrs. Vale softly, though no one attended to her. "It would not." Her eyes moved again across the scene. The crates, the trampled grass, the narrow path leading toward the churchyard gate. Beyond it, the lane curved out of sight behind a row of yew trees, and anyone leaving that way might have done so unnoticed in the confusion, particularly if they had no reason to attract attention. But then, why remain? Why allow Daniel to confess at once? Unless... She let the thought rest. Near the hedge, Beatrice Lark had sunk onto a low crate, her hands twisting in her lap. Florence Kershaw stood beside her, speaking in a low, firm voice. Beatrice nodded repeatedly, though whether in agreement or simple desperation was unclear. Every few moments her eyes darted toward Celia, then away again. Fear, Mrs. Vale thought, could take many shapes. One learned to distinguish between them. "Take him along," Tibbet said at last. The constables stepped forward. Daniel did not resist, but as they moved him away, he turned his head once more toward Celia. "Leave it," he said quietly. "It's done." "No," she whispered. "It isn't." Their eyes held for a moment, and in that silent exchange there was something more binding than affection, something like a shared burden or a promise neither had fully chosen. Then Daniel was led away. The crowd began to disperse in uneasy fragments, people drifting back toward the abandoned stalls, speaking in lowered voices that carried farther than they intended. The fête had ended without announcement. Its cheerful order had dissolved into suspicion, and every familiar face now seemed to hold the possibility of something concealed. Mrs. Pritchard came up beside Mrs. Vale, breathless and indignant. "Well, if that isn't the most disgraceful business, confessing when one hasn't done it, or denying when one has, I hardly know which is worse." Mrs. Vale did not answer at once. She was watching Celia, who stood very still near the bandstand, as though unsure what to do now that the immediate crisis had passed. "At least," Mrs. Pritchard continued, "it's quite clear where the matter lies. Either the young man is guilty or the young woman is lying. There can't be much in between." "Oh, I think there can," said Mrs. Vale gently. She looked once more toward the churchyard path, the empty space where the knife ought to have been, and then at the faces of those who had remained. "The trouble," she added, almost to herself, "is that the wrong person has told the truth first." The green did not empty all at once. People lingered in uncertain clusters, as though reluctant to leave the place where something so extraordinary had occurred, yet equally unwilling to remain too near it. The bandstand stood abandoned now, its bunting stirring idly in the breeze, while the crates and hedge cast longer shadows than they had an hour before. Mrs. Vale remained where she was for a little while longer, not from hesitation, but from habit. There was always a moment after such disturbances when people revealed more than they intended, not by what they said, but by what they did when they believed the worst was already known. Sia Dorrance had not moved. She stood with her hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed not on the place where Hugo Fenwick had fallen, but somewhere slightly to one side of it, as though she could not bear to look directly at the reality of it. Florence Kershaw approached her again, speaking quietly, and this time Celia allowed herself to be guided a few steps away toward the vicarage path. She went without resistance, but not without awareness. Her eyes lifted once, searching the thinning crowd again, and Mrs. Vale had the distinct impression that she was not looking for comfort, but for confirmation. Of what, it was not yet clear. Near the hedge, Beatrice Locke had recovered sufficiently to stand, though she still clutched at the edge of a stall as though the world might tilt again at any moment. She spoke in low, urgent tones to Sir Basil, who listened with the expression of a man absorbing information he did not quite understand, but felt obliged to take seriously. "I tell you I didn't see anything," Beatrice was saying, only that she was there, and then he was there, and then—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her throat. "She?" Sir Basil repeated. "You mean Miss Dorrance?" Beatrice hesitated, just for an instant. Then she nodded. "Yes, of course." Mrs. Vale's eyes sharpened slightly. There had been that pause again. It was a very small thing, the sort of thing that passed unnoticed in ordinary conversation. But there were few things less ordinary than a murder, and Mrs. Vale had long ago learned that the smallest hesitations often concealed the largest truths. She turned her attention next to the path leading beyond the hedge. The constables had ceased their search there, having found nothing, and now stood talking together in subdued voices. The grass was disturbed, certainly, trampled by feet both before and after the event, but there was no clear sign of anything having been deliberately hidden or discarded, which meant, most likely, that it had not been. Mrs. Vale stepped forward at last, moving with quiet deliberation toward the place where Hugo Fenwick had fallen. And the body had been covered now with a coat, though the outline beneath it remained unmistakable. She did not look at it directly. Instead, she looked at the ground around it, at the angle of the fallen hat in the nettles, at the slight scuff near the edge of the path. Dr. Kershaw, returning from a brief exchange with Sergeant Tibbet, noticed her and paused. "Mrs. Vale," he said, not unkindly. "I don't think you ought to." No, she said gently. "I quite agree. One ought not to interfere. It only complicates things." He relaxed a fraction, though his expression remained troubled. "An unpleasant business." "Yes," said Mrs. Vale, "though not, I think, a complicated one." He looked at her with mild surprise. "You think not?" She gave a small, apologetic smile. "Complications usually arise when people tell the truth in awkward ways. Here, as it seems to me, they have taken pains not to do so." Before he could respond, Florence called him away, and he went, shaking his head slightly as though uncertain whether to be reassured or more deeply concerned. Mrs. Vale remained a moment longer, then turned and made her way slowly toward the lane. She did not go far, only as far as the curve where the yew trees cast their deep shade across the path. There she paused again, looking down at the ground with the same quiet attentiveness she had shown before. For a little while, there was nothing. Then she bent, very slightly, and adjusted the tip of her umbrella against the edge of the path. A faint mark had been made there, so faint it might have been overlooked entirely. Not a footprint exactly, but the impression of something pressed briefly into the soft earth and withdrawn again. Something narrow, something deliberate. Mrs. Vale straightened. Behind her, the murmur of the village continued, subdued now, threaded with unease. Ahead, the lane lay empty and still, curving out of sight as though it led away, not merely from the green, but from the simple version of events the village had already begun to construct. She stood there for a moment, considering. Then she turned back, her expression as mild and untroubled as ever, though her eyes had grown just a little more thoughtful. Because somewhere between the confession that had come too quickly and the denial that had come too late, something essential had been misplaced, and unlike the knife, she did not think it had gone very far. When Mrs. Vale returned to the green, the air had changed again, not in the dramatic way of the scream, but in something quieter and more persistent. The fate was no longer an event. It was a memory already being shaped into versions. People spoke in lowered voices, each account slightly different, each certainty resting on very little. That, she reflected, was always how it began. Celia had been taken into the vicarage sitting room. Through the open window, Mrs. Vale could see her seated rigidly on a straight-backed chair, while Florence Kershaw moved about with purposeful efficiency, preparing tea that no one would properly drink. Mrs. Fenlow had installed herself near the door under the pretense of assistance and was clearly absorbing every possible detail. Mrs. Vale did not go in at once. Instead, she paused near the low stone wall where Miss Agnes Trewin stood speaking in hushed urgency to Mrs. Pritchard. "I'm telling you," Miss Trewin was saying. "There was a letter, this very morning. I saw her take it from the post. Foreign paper, too. Not our usual sort, and she looked quite done when she read it." Mrs. Pritchard pursed her lips. Letters often upset people. It does not follow they lead to murder. "No," said Miss Trewin darkly, "but they frequently explain it." Mrs. Vale inclined her head slightly as though merely passing, though she missed none of it. A letter, that fitted. Not as cause, perhaps, but as disturbance. She moved on, crossing the green toward the vicarage at last. Florence glanced up as she entered, and though she said nothing, she stepped back a fraction, making space without appearing to do so. Celia looked up too. For a moment she said nothing. Then very quietly, "Mrs. Vale." "My dear," said Mrs. Vale gently, taking the chair opposite her, "you mustn't feel obliged to speak unless you wish to. People often ask questions far too soon." Celia's hands tightened together. "They'll ask anyway." "Yes," said Mrs. Vale, "but one need not always answer the question that is asked." Celia gave a faint, strained smile at that. It faded almost immediately. "They think Daniel did it." "Yes, and he says he did." "Yes, but he didn't." Her voice trembled again, though she held it steady with visible effort. "He couldn't have." Mrs. Vale regarded her quietly. "Couldn't," she repeated, as though considering the word rather than the statement. Celia hesitated. He wouldn't." "Ah," said Mrs. Vale softly. "That is rather different." Celia flushed slightly. "You think I'm mistaken?" "I think," said Mrs. Vale, "'cause that people sometimes tell untruths for reasons that have very little to do with guilt." Celia's eyes flickered. "You mean Daniel?" "I mean anyone." There was a pause. Outside, a cart rattled faintly along the distant road. Inside, the ticking of the vicarage clock seemed unusually loud. At last, Celia said, "He followed us." "Yes. Hugo wanted to speak to me alone." The name caught slightly in her throat, but she continued. "He said it was important, that I must hear him before things went too far." "And had they?" asked Mrs. Vale gently. Celia looked down. "I thought so." Mrs. Vale did not press that. "We went behind the bandstand," Celia went on. "He was agitated, not like himself. He kept saying it had all been a mistake, that he meant to set it right. And then—" She stopped. "And then?" prompted Mrs. Vale. "There was someone else," Celia said. The words fell into the room with quiet weight. Mrs. Vale did not move. "You saw them?" "No." Celia shook her head quickly. No, I didn't see. I only heard. A step or something against the crates. Hugo heard it too. He turned, just for a second, and then... Her hand rose involuntarily to her chest. It happened very quickly, she finished. And Daniel? He came almost at once. He must have been just behind us. I think he saw Hugo fall. Her voice lowered. I think he thought I... She stopped again. Mrs. Vale finished it for her, very softly. That you had done it. Celia nodded once, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And so he said that he had. Yes, there it was. Not love, precisely. Not even sacrifice in the romantic sense, but something simpler and perhaps more dangerous. An instinct to take upon oneself what one believed another could not bear. Mrs. Vale folded her hands in her lap. You did not see the person who was there before Daniel? She asked. No, but you are certain there was someone. Yes, Celia's voice steadied. I'm sure of it. Mrs. Vale inclined her head. That, at least, was clear. And yet, she thought again of Beatrice's hesitation, of the faint mark on the lane, of the missing knife that had not been dropped where it ought. No one saw them leave, Celia added, almost to herself. No, said Mrs. Vale quietly. That is always the interesting part. Celia looked up. What do you mean? Mrs. Vale smiled, very gently. Only that, she said. People are much easier to notice when they arrive than when they go. And in that small difference, she suspected, you lay the first real step toward the truth. Hartswell had resumed its routines, but not its peace. Curtains twitched more often than usual. Conversations stopped when others approached. The ironmongery remained closed, and the vicarage received more visitors than it could politely accommodate, all bearing sympathy and all hoping for something more than they were told. By 4 o'clock, Sergeant Tibbet had gathered the principal figures into the vicarage drawing-room at Mrs. Vale's quiet suggestion, though the suggestion had been framed so gently that he believed it entirely his own idea. Sir Basil stood near the mantel, indignant but attentive. Florence Kershaw remained upright and watchful beside her brother. Beatrice Lark sat on the edge of a chair, pale and restless, her gloved hands twisting together. Celia was composed now, and though the effort showed in the stillness of her face. Mrs. Vale took a modest seat near the window. Tibbet cleared his throat. "We are here," he began, "because certain inconsistencies have arisen. Mr. Mercer's confession is in doubt. Miss Dorrance has raised objections, and the weapon remains unaccounted for. Mrs. Vale has observations she wishes to share." He said it with slight reluctance. Mrs. Vale inclined her head. "Only a few small ones?" No one spoke. She folded her hands lightly. "It seemed to me," she began, "that the difficulty lay not in what was done, but in the order in which it was said. Mr. Mercer confessed immediately, before anyone had properly understood the situation. Miss Dorrance denied it, but only afterward, and not by offering an alternative, only by insisting he was wrong." She paused, letting that settle. That is not how truth usually behaves. Truth tends to emerge reluctantly. What we saw instead was something offered too quickly, and something withheld too carefully. Beatrice made a small, involuntary movement. Mrs. Vale's eyes rested on her. Then there was the matter of the knife. It was not found because it was not dropped. That was evident from the beginning. A man who had just committed such an act would not be uncertain where he had left the weapon, unless, of course, he had never held it at all. Daniel's absence seemed to fill the room more strongly at that moment, which left us with someone else, Mrs. Vale continued gently. Someone who had been present before Mr. Mercer arrived, someone Miss Dorrance heard but did not see, and someone who was able to leave without attracting attention. Her gaze moved again, calmly, onto Beatrice. And that, I think, is where the difficulty resolves itself. Beatrice's lips parted. I don't understand." "No," said Mrs. Vale kindly, "but you do remember." The silence tightened. "You told us," Mrs. Vale went on, "that you saw Miss Dorrance, and then Mr. Fenwick, and then Mr. Mercer. You hesitated, only for a moment, before saying so. It was very slight, but one does not hesitate over things one has seen clearly, only over things one is deciding how to say." Beatrice shook her head quickly. "No, I was upset. That's all." "Of course you were," said Mrs. Vale. "Anyone would be. But you were also there earlier than you said." Beatrice's breathing quickened. Mrs. Vale's voice remained soft. "You spoke to Mr. Fenwick shortly before the incident. Several people saw it. He said something to you, something that distressed you. Something perhaps connected with money." Sir Basil frowned. "Money?" Mrs. Vale nodded. "Mr. Fenwick was a man who made himself agreeable very quickly. It is often a useful skill, particularly when one requires assistance or leverage. I think he had some hold over you, Mrs. Lark. A debt, perhaps, or knowledge of one." Beatrice gave a broken sound. I couldn't let him." "No," said Mrs. Vale gently. "You could not. So you followed him. You heard him speaking with Miss Dorrance. You waited, and when his attention was turned, only for a second, you stepped forward and struck." A sharp intake of breath circled the room. "The wound was precise," Mrs. Vale continued. "Not wild, not uncertain, a steady hand. You have one, Mrs. Lark. You use it every day with your accounts, your stitching, your careful little economies. It is not difficult to guide a blade if one has decided to do so." Beatrice shook her head weakly, tears spilling now. "I didn't mean, I only wanted to stop him." "But you did not drop the knife," said Mrs. Vale. "You took it with you. Along the lane, there is a small mark there, a sign of something narrow being pressed briefly into the earth. You paused, perhaps to hide it, perhaps to consider what you had done." Beatrice's hands fell limp in her lap. "No one saw you leave," Mrs. Vale finished softly, "because no one was looking for you. All attention was fixed on what came next, on Mr. Mercer, who arrived, saw Miss Dorrance beside a fallen man, and believed the worst." Celia closed her eyes. "And so he confessed," Mrs. Vale said, "not to protect himself, but to protect her. And Miss Dorrance denied it, not by revealing the truth, but by trying to undo the lie without exposing what she did not fully understand." The room remained very still. Beatrice let out a long, shuddering breath. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "He said he would tell everything about the money, about how I'd managed. I thought if I could just frighten him." Her voice broke completely. Sergeant Tibbet stepped forward, his expression grim but certain now. "I think," he said, "that will do." No one spoke as he led Beatrice away. After a time, Sir Basil cleared his throat, though he seemed unsure what to say. Florence moved quietly to Celia's side. Dr. Kershaw stared at the floor, his thoughts turned inward. Mrs. Vale rose. As she stepped out into the late afternoon light, the village seemed very much as it had before. Quiet, ordered, composed. And yet something had shifted beneath it. Something that would not entirely settle again. Mrs. Pritchard joined her at the gate. "Well," she said, "I suppose that explains it. Though I must say, it is a very disagreeable business." "Yes," said Mrs. Vale. They walked a little way in silence. "It is always the quiet ones," Mrs. Pritchard added after a moment. Mrs. Vale smiled faintly. "Not always," she said. "Only the ones who believe they have no other choice." She paused, glancing back once toward the vicarage, where voices still murmured behind closed doors. "The curious thing," she added thoughtfully, "is how often the truth arrives second, and must wait for the wrong person to speak first." Then she turned away, her step as light and unhurried as ever, leaving Hartswell to its hedges, its habits, and its newly uncovered secrets.